Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement. And if you want to lead your own movement for your autism and neurodivergent athletes, then look no further to the Autism Fitness Level 1 certification. There are only 2 live virtual practical dates. That's where you get the hands-on, feet-on, brains-on training that you and your athletes or future athletes deserve. Only 2 live virtual practical dates left in 2023, one September 25th, one December 3rd. Register now, start your coursework, and join me for one of those. So welcome again to Tuesday Training. And in this Tuesday Training, we are going to be discussing the difference, the contrast, the realities of sports programs versus general fitness programs for the autism and neurodivergent populations. So the overarching theme here is sports are not necessarily bad, but we have to compare and contrast it to, and then ask big questions about, first, what are our goals? What is the goal for this curriculum, and how can we actually measure and observe those goals coming to fruition? What do we see? How do we implement all of these important questions that we need to answer when we're implementing any curriculum, educational, physical, or otherwise? And we have to look at sports through the lens of what are we trying to accomplish, and how does this work for the autism and neurodivergent population? So as always, we can look at it through the lens of the PAC profile, the operating system of Autism Fitness. So PAC stands for physical, adaptive, and cognitive. And if we look at sports programs, we can break it down into all 3. So looking at it through the lens of physical ability, sports are very finite in nature. So for example, kicking a soccer ball or hitting a golf ball, hitting a volleyball, any of these sports-based activities are finite. They're very specific to and only to that particular sport. They don't generalize outside of the confines of that sport very well. So if we're just looking at participating in the sport and playing the sport to get better at the sport, that's one thing. But if we're using sports as a springboard to better strength, stability, stamina, and motor planning in the real world, not going to happen so much. That's why we utilize general fitness, but more on that in a little bit. From an adaptive perspective, well, individuals with autism, and this is a general statement, but we can get into it. Individuals on the autism spectrum with related neurodivergencies often do not want to participate or have a great deal of difficulty participating in sports programs. They just don't have the drive or motivation to. But this is just not the autism population in particular. If we look at the neurotypical population, there are only a percentage of kids and adolescents and teenagers and then adults who are going to be participating in a competitive sport. So we have to ask, what is the long-term developmental process at work here? And then from a motivational perspective, and I've seen this many, many times, you have an athlete who is interested in kicking the soccer ball or throwing the basketball, but when we're talking about it with relation to the full context or practice of an actual competitive game, not so much. They just want to do the thing in isolation, right? So from an adaptive perspective, we have to ask whether or not this makes sense for not only the individual, but the group as well. And finally, we get to the cognitive. The cognitive, of course, we're breaking down into neurological and neuromuscular. So the neurological is going to be understanding the expectation, having the ability to communicate, understanding the sequence, and so forth. Sports, particularly competitive sports, tend to be a controlled chaos situation, and the speed of gameplay is often something that is going to be overwhelming for individuals with autism or related neurodivergencies. So we have to ask, are they actually able to participate meaningfully in this program? And if not, The question is, how can we scale it? Does it make sense to scale it? Again, what are the outcomes that we are looking for? If the outcomes are simply to participate in that particular class or in that sport, then fine, we can work with that. But if we have greater goals with respect to, we want to build skills that are going to generalize, we want to build long-term developmental skills, well, then we have to turn away from sports because, again, they're finite. They are simply not going to produce those type of physiological changes for those individuals or any individual. For that matter, the sport is going to be related to the sport. When we look at more general fitness, that's where we're talking about transferring or generalizing to activities of daily living and developing the strength, stability, motor planning, and stamina that is going to make a difference in someone's life. Again, sports are not bad, but they're not going to provide that type of outcome. So I spoke a little bit about sports. Let's talk about that in contrast to general fitness training, the type that we do in autism fitness. So when we're developing a general movement program or a general strength and conditioning program for our autism and neurodivergent athletes, we're looking at how do we improve the major motor patterns, so pushing, pulling, squatting, carrying, locomotion. How do we do this in a way that is meeting the athlete at their current level of ability with each one of those skills? How are we scaling it, so modifying it or progressing it based on their physical abilities? And also, how are we building in motivation, reinforcement, engagement for each individual? But just as importantly, each individual within a group too. So if we're talking about adapted PE programming, well, how are we reaching individual goals within a group setting, and what makes sense for that group as far as a structure? Are we interested in having these skills develop? So from an adaptive perspective, when we work on general fitness skills, we can scale it and we can also focus on what is motivating for that particular athlete. We can also start developing resilience for that athlete as well, in that maybe they participate initially for 30 seconds or 3 seconds, and we gradually build that up. Finally, on the cognitive side, one of the major drawbacks of sports activities is they tend to be very abstract. The idea of scoring a point, of getting a goal, of the defensive component is abstract, and it can be, again, very overwhelming. With fitness-based activities or general movement-based activities, we can make the level of comprehension as clear as we need it to for the athlete. And we do this with contingencies, we do this with choice, and we do this with repetition. And then from the neuromuscular perspective, and this may be the single biggest factor in the decision making, what we know is that our autism and neurodivergent athletes need a lot of practice with the same movements in order to get better at them, in order to develop that strength, that stability, that motor planning, that stamina, in order to develop that neuromuscular connection where the exercise is performed independently and they are actually capable of doing it to the point where there's mastery and it generalizes to the outside world, right? Think about the amount of opportunities that an individual might get during the average adapted PE or general PE session to actually participate. So, they get to dribble the basketball once or twice in a 35 to 45 minute period. That's not developing any skills in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. It's participating, but it's participating on paper mostly. So, in conclusion, and this is a much longer conversation, and this is why we have the Autism Fitness Level 1 certification, so that this conversation goes on. But what is going to be the most meaningful, the most productive, the most generalizable type of program for our autism and neurodivergent athletes? If it's a sports-based curriculum, that's fine, but we really have to start asking these questions about what makes the most sense, what are we trying to achieve, and how is the athlete able to participate here? So just some things to think about. Definitely something that you might want to pass on to anybody who's involved in adapted physical education, any parents who might be interested in in how their child's program works. So if this has been helpful for you, please like, subscribe, and share. I am Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen. Thank you for watching this edition of Tuesday Training.